Hey friends. So I had a meeting this morning, and this is there's a particular kind of experience that I've learned to identify, and I think in a lot of ways really thrive on. And essentially, it comes down to a desire, or at least a willingness, a readiness to take on the responsibility for a certain kind of leadership. And even as I say that, I realize it sounds kind of abstract, and I think in my own understanding of what it is, it's not yet fully crystallized. I haven't quite. I don't know that I know exactly what this is yet, but it's something that comes through me in certain moments, in certain circumstances, and basically it's kind of like an understanding, an intuitive understanding that it's time to take responsibility for something. It might be a conversation. It might be for someone else's experience of a conversation or of an environment. But there's a way in which I naturally can tell, okay, here's how to lead this. Here's how to lead in this moment. And it really comes down to responsibility. It comes down to taking responsibility. And this is something I've thought a lot about over the years, and observed a lot of different kinds of contexts, a lot of different kinds of collaborative work, collaborative projects. And if I've learned anything about the collaborative process, it's that it functions best when everyone is willing to lead and everyone is willing to follow. So in other words, everyone is there, everyone is ready to take as much responsibility as is required, up to all of it. And also everyone is willing to let anyone else, or the right person, hold that responsibility, because we can kind of recognize that's who should have it right now. It's evident in the exchange, it's evident in the conversation or in the interaction that a particular person is qualified for this, is right for this. And it takes me all the way back to when I was reading Ken Wilber back in the day. I read probably a dozen books at least of Ken Wilber's, the American philosopher. He wrote one book called Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, in which he talks about different types of hierarchies. And I forget what he even calls it. It might be like just an integral hierarchy. Integral is kind of his thing, his word. But basically, it's a hierarchy where it's dynamic. It's a dynamic hierarchy. It's not a rigid hierarchy. It's one where leadership can flow, but it's also not one in which responsibility and power is assumed to be distributed evenly among equal democratic members. That's not. He sort of talks very articulately about why that is very problematic, and that's something I've seen in a variety of contexts. Often in my theater work, I've encountered environments where ostensibly everyone shares an equal amount of power, and by and large it doesn't tend to work very well. It works when everybody's willing to assume more or less power as the circumstances deem appropriate. If everybody's willing to move and potentially completely surrender, follow because it's the right thing, because there's a shared understanding that someone else is leading well, or and alternately the opposite is also true, though, and anyone is willing to step forward because it becomes clear to them or everyone else that they're the right person to lead. And so I've always been kind of fascinated by this idea of a dynamic hierarchy, and I've in a lot of ways I have wished for a context in which I could experience that. I've wished for environments and most of all, people, the other people who can work in this way and who want to work in this way and who have both that sensitivity and also that courage to step up. And it's not every day that you get that, but I had a meeting earlier today that it was like a really satisfying example of that. Everybody in the room was willing to step up and lead, and everybody in the room was really willing to step back and possibly follow. And it was just, super satisfying. I remember back many years ago, I was living in London at the time. I did it was like a coaching questionnaire thing where you answer a bunch of questions and then he tells you what type you are. And it was like not one of the big ones like Enneagram or Tony Robbins. It was like some coach in London who I think actually is still doing it. He seems to be still going at it. But I took his quiz and he came back. Leadership was my main number one thing. It was it was intellectual leadership and intuitive leadership, neck and neck. Intuitive just above intellectual. But it was like you're supposed to. It was from a wide variety of categories. I could have had any of a number of different categories on my sort of right brain and or left brain side, but I had leadership on both. And I was like, at the time, I was kind of like, this quiz is bunk. Like, I don't know. What does that even mean? What is that leadership? What does leadership mean without a context? You're qualified for leadership by a context and a skill set or a capacity, some sort of capacity. So the notion that leadership was somehow a quality in the abstract, I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And I think it makes more sense to me now. I think it actually, now that I've lived long enough and I've done enough things, I've operated in enough contexts that I'm like, oh, actually, there's an impulse that's just kind of fundamental to who I am. And it has manifested in any number of different contexts. And it's not always by being a leader. It's not always that at all. It's just I'm keenly aware of leadership and I'm keenly aware of leadership dynamics. Just I can't not think about them. And I'm generally very quickly irritated by what I consider to be poor leadership or illegitimate leadership. When somebody is like not willing to step back and follow when it is evident that they're either not the right person or they don't have the right idea, or somebody else is bringing something that's really promising and really really right, but now it's like that's perceived as a threat rather than an asset to the group, mostly because of a kind of status battle thing that drives me nuts. I get hives from it, and I've known that about myself for ages. What I have not always understood about myself, I think, or what I may be just getting a slightly deeper understanding of, is that the reason that affects me so powerfully is because I actually do have an underlying kind of leadership impulse that I literally just said. I'm not even sure what context maybe it doesn't need maybe it doesn't need a single context in which to work, but I've been able to distinguish that from my qualifications in a field that put me in a position to be a leader in a field for, because I'm an expert at it or a semi-expert. So that's an interesting thing to notice about myself, and it's an interesting thing to see how satisfying it is to have that dose and that conversation, like I had earlier today, where it's like it ticks all the boxes of exactly what that experience, what I imagine that experience can be like, what I have imagined it can be like. It's not that I've never had it before. It's just it doesn't happen that often, and it's you appreciate the people who are there with you when you're doing that together, because it's such a level of both sensitivity to each other. So everyone feels very seen and very, very. Everyone feels the ability to be expressed. No one is being. There's enough sensitivity that everyone's gift, everyone's contribution, is going to be seen, going to be acknowledged, and anyone and everyone is willing to step up and have the courage to bring what they have and to take over the group, to say this is what we need, or like to confidently grab the reins when they get the input, when they can feel that. There's just nothing more fun than that. More fun is not the right word, but more inspiring than that and more satisfying than that for me. So that was a really great experience today, obviously, and and it does in a lot of ways open up some questions for me, like along the lines of, well, how can I do more of that? How can I do more of that? What's the pathway? What's the process that I'm looking for to be able to express that aspect of myself, and to really, it's been, because it's hard to define, or at least it's hard to define the context in which I wanted to operate. I've had some reticence to really, I think, embrace it fully. And I think that's something I would do well to examine and ask myself, well, why? What's the reticence? What if that thing is enough? And yes, you have to find a context, and yes, you have to do the legwork of actually figuring out, well, how should I position myself so that this gift, this contribution, can be received, can make a difference. Like, what's the right place for me to put it? But I think acknowledging that it on its own, that impulse towards leadership and towards dynamic leadership, dynamic hierarchy, a kind of flow state hierarchy, that's a thing. It doesn't need to manifest in a context before it's a thing. It's a thing unto itself. Feels like an important step for me. So that's what I got today, folks. That's what came through loud and clear this morning. And I got another meeting tomorrow. Maybe it'll be the same. That would be awesome. But thanks for watching. I appreciate you. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.